The bitter wind of late December 1776 cut through the tattered uniforms of the Continental Army like a blade through parchment. General George Washington stood on the banks of the Delaware River, his weathered hands gripping the reins of his horse as he surveyed the demoralized remnants of what had once been America's hope for independence. The recent defeats at New York had scattered his forces like leaves before a hurricane, and now, with enlistments set to expire at midnight on December 31st, it seemed the revolution would die not with a bang, but with the quiet shuffle of defeated men returning to their farms. The situation was desperate beyond measure. British General William Howe had established winter quarters across New Jersey, confident that the rebellion would collapse under its own weight before spring arrived. Hessian mercenaries, led by Colonel Johann Gabelabral, had occupied Trenton, treating the town as their personal prize after months of easy victories. The professional soldiers from Hesse-Kassel had grown complacent, viewing the ragged Continentals as little more than farmers playing at war. Washington knew that bold action was required, not just to salvage the military situation, but to revive the dying spirit of independence that had burned so brightly just months before. The pamphleteer Thomas Paine had recently published his latest work, reminding Americans that these are the times that try men's souls. And Washington felt the weight of those words, pressing upon his shoulders like a millstone dot as documented in David Hackett Fisher's comprehensive study, Washington's Crossing. The general had been formulating an audacious plan that would either revive the revolution or seal its doom. The strategy was simple in concept, but perilous in execution. Cross the ice-choked Delaware on Christmas night, strike the surprised Hessians at Trenton, and then if fortune smiled upon them continue north to Princeton, where British reinforcements waited. Captain Alexander Hamilton, Washington's young aide-de-camp, watched his commander with a mixture of admiration and concern. The general's face bore the lines of a man who had aged years in mere months, yet his eyes still held the fire that had inspired a continent to take up arms against the mightiest empire on earth. Hamilton had witnessed firsthand the gradual erosion of the army's strength, watching as entire regiments simply melted away into the countryside, their members choosing the warmth of home over the uncertain glory of revolution. The Continental Army that remained was a shadow of its former self. Many soldiers marched barefoot through the snow, leaving bloody prints that marked their passage like a crimson thread through the white landscape. Their muskets were often unreliable, their powder frequently damp, and their resolve tested by months of retreat and defeat. Yet something in Washington's bearing suggested that he had not yet accepted defeat, that somewhere in his strategic mind, he had found a path through the darkness. The crossing would require precise timing and extraordinary luck. The Delaware was running high with winter floods, packed with ice floes that could crush the flat-bottomed Durham boats like kindling. 3 separate columns would need to coordinate their movements across nearly 10 miles of treacherous river, then march through the night to arrive at their targets before dawn revealed their presence to enemy sentries. As Christmas Day faded, in the evening, Washington gathered his officers for final instructions. The password for the night would be victory or death, words that seemed to capture perfectly the desperate nature of their enterprise. There would be no retreat this time, no strategic withdrawal to fight another day. Everything depended on the next 36 hours, and every man present understood that they were about to stake the future of American independence on a single, desperate gamble. The attack on Trenton had exceeded even Washington's most optimistic expectations. In less than an hour of fighting on December 26th, the Continental Army had captured nearly 1,000 Hessian soldiers, seized invaluable supplies, and most importantly, proved to themselves and the world that they could defeat professional European troops. Colonel Rahl lay mortally wounded, his overconfidence having cost him his life and his command their freedom. The victory sent shockwaves through British headquarters and rekindled the flame of resistance in patriot hearts across the 13 colonies. But Washington understood that a single victory, however dramatic, would not secure independence. The British would respond with overwhelming force, and General Cornwallis was already marching south from New York with 8,000 seasoned troops. The Continental Army found itself in an impossible position. They could not remain in Trenton, where they would be trapped against the Delaware, nor could they simply retreat across the river and surrender the psychological advantage they had gained. Captain James Wilkinson, serving as a courier between the various Continental units, brought disturbing intelligence to Washington's headquarters in the early hours of December 27th. British patrols were already probing toward Trenton, and intercepted communications suggested that Cornwallis intended to arrive within 2 days. With enough force to crush the Continental Army completely, the window of opportunity was closing. With terrifying speed, it was during this crucial moment that Washington conceived perhaps his most brilliant tactical insight of the entire war. Rather than retreat or attempt to defend Trenton, he would use the town as bait, drawing Cornwallis into a trap while simultaneously striking at the British supply depot at Princeton. The plan required splitting his already small force, maintaining the fiction of defending Trenton while secretly preparing for a night march that would bring him to Princeton's outskirts by dawn. The intelligence gathered by Continental scouts painted a clear picture of British dispositions around Princeton. The town itself was lightly held, with most of the regular troops having marched south to join Cornwallis. The remaining garrison consisted primarily of the 40th Foot and elements of the 55th Foot, veteran regiments, but numbering fewer than 1,200 men in total. More importantly, these troops were scattered between the town itself and the temporary fortifications at Nassau Hall, the imposing stone building that served as the seat of the College of New Jersey. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Scott, commanding the Continental Light Infantry, had spent the previous day conducting reconnaissance in civilian clothes, posing as a local farmer selling provisions. His reports confirmed that the British had grown complacent, assuming that Washington's army was battered and demoralized to attempt another offensive operation so soon after Trenton. This overconfidence would prove to be their undoing. Washington's plan required extraordinary coordination and no small amount of deception. While a small force under Colonel Edward Hand would maintain campfires and continue patrolling around Trenton to suggest the entire army remained in position, the main body would slip away in the pre-dawn darkness of January 2nd, 1777. The route to Princeton would take them along obscure country roads, guided by local militia who knew every farm lane and forest path in the region. As evening approached on January 2nd, Washington gathered his officers for what would prove to be one of the most crucial briefings of the Revolutionary War. The general's voice was hoarse from the strain of the previous week's operations, but his words carried the weight of destiny as he outlined an audacious plan that would either secure American independence or result in the complete destruction of the Continental Army. The march would begin at midnight, with strict orders for absolute silence, no talking, no unnecessary noise, and certainly no fires that might reveal their movement to British patrols. Each regiment would follow a precise timetable, with the artillery under Captain Hamilton taking a parallel route to avoid the noise of wheels on frozen ground, alerting enemy sentries. By dawn, if fortune favored their cause, the Continental Army would be in position to strike Princeton before the British garrison realized they had been outmaneuvered. The Continental Army began its silent exodus from Trenton as the church bells of the town struck midnight on January 2nd, 1777. Washington rode at the head of the column, his familiar figure barely visible in the darkness as nearly 5,000 men began what would become one of the most famous night marches in military history. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and the rutted roads were treacherous with ice. But the men moved with a purpose that had been absent for months. General Nathanael Greene commanded the main column, taking the longer but safer route along the back roads toward Princeton. His men included the battle-tested veterans of Sullivan's division, their confidence restored by the victory at Trenton, along with fresh militiamen whose enthusiasm compensated for their lack of training. The parallel column under General John Sullivan would approach Princeton from the southwest, completing the encirclement of the British position while Greene struck from the northeast. The march tested every aspect of military discipline. Soldiers wrapped their muskets in cloth to prevent the metal from clanking against their equipment, and officers passed orders through whispered chains of command that extended back through the darkness like invisible threads. The artillery proved particularly challenging, as Captain Hamilton's guns needed to traverse the same icy roads that had nearly crippled horses and men alike, yet any sound of metal on stone could alert British patrols miles away. Local guides proved invaluable during these crucial hours. Men like Thomas Clark and Jacob Heyer, farmers who had lived their entire lives in the Princeton area, led different sections of the army along paths that appeared on no military maps. These local patriots risked everything to support Washington's audacious gamble, knowing that capture would mean hanging as traitors to the British crown. As recorded in William Stryker's definitive account, the battles of Trenton and Princeton The Continental Army demonstrated remarkable discipline during the march, with few incidents despite the challenging conditions. The men understood that their nation's independence hung in the balance, and that understanding translated into a level of professionalism that would have impressed European military observers. Dawn approached with agonizing slowness as the column stretched across several miles of frozen countryside. Washington had timed the march to arrive at Princeton, just as the morning light would provide enough visibility for coordinated action, while still maintaining the element of surprise. The general rode constantly between different sections of his army, ensuring that the complex timing remained synchronized despite the challenges of moving thousands of men along multiple routes in complete darkness. At approximately 6 in the morning, as the eastern sky began to show the first pale traces of dawn, the advance guard under Captain John Flavin spotted the first British sentries near the Stony Brook Bridge, about 2 miles south of Princeton. The moment of truth had arrived. Within minutes, the element of surprise would be lost, and the Continental Army would be committed to battle, whether they were fully prepared or not. The British garrison at Princeton remained blissfully unaware of the approaching danger. Captain Charles Mawhood, commanding the local forces, had received no intelligence suggesting American movement from Trenton, and his morning reports indicated nothing unusual in the surrounding countryside. The previous day's routine had been broken only by the departure of additional reinforcements to join Cornwallis, further reducing the already thin defensive perimeter around the town. Washington made his final tactical adjustments as the two columns converged on their objectives. Sullivan's force would sweep round to cut off the road to New Brunswick, preventing British reinforcements or retreat in that direction, while Greene's column would assault the town directly. The artillery would establish positions on the high ground overlooking Nassau Hall, where the main British defensive position had been prepared. Captain Hamilton, despite his youth, had emerged as one of Washington's most trusted subordinates, and he would play a crucial role in the coming battle. His battery of guns would need to neutralize British resistance quickly, before superior enemy training could organize an effective defense. The next few hours would determine whether the Continental Army's remarkable night march would culminate in victory or catastrophe, and every officer present understood that there would be no opportunity for retreat if the attack failed. The first shots of the Battle of Princeton rang out at approximately 7:30 on the morning of January 3, 1777, when British foragers encountered Captain Rodney's advance guard near the William Clark farmhouse. The sharp crack of musket fire shattered the winter silence, and within moments, both armies were deploying for what would become the decisive engagement of Washington's winter campaign. Captain Charles Mawhood had been marching south toward Trenton with elements of the 17th and 55th Foot when the sound of gunfire brought him to a halt. An experienced officer who had served in the Caribbean campaigns, Mawhood immediately grasped the tactical situation. American forces were approaching Princeton in strength, threatening to cut his communication lines with the main British Army. His decision to turn and fight rather than continue toward Trenton would prove both courageous and costly. The initial engagement developed rapidly into a meeting battle, with both sides deploying from march formation under the pressure of enemy fire. General Hugh Mercer, commanding the Continental Advance Guard, attempted to secure the high ground near the Thomas Clark farm, but his men found themselves facing seasoned British regulars, who maintained their discipline despite the surprise of the American attack. The British infantry advanced with the mechanical precision that had made them feared across European battlefields. Their scarlet uniforms stood out dramatically against the snow-covered landscape as they formed their battle lines with practiced efficiency. The morning light revealed the distinctive tall mitre caps of the Grenadier Company's elite troops, whose reputation for ferocity had been earned in countless battles from Minden to Quebec. General Mercer's brigade bore the initial brunt of the British counterattack. These Continental troops, many of them veterans of the New York campaigns, fought with desperate courage but found themselves outmatched by professional soldiers who had perfected their trade through years of warfare. The British bayonet charge that followed their initial volley drove the Americans back across the frozen fields, and in the confusion of retreat, General Mercer himself fell wounded, struck down by British bayonets near the Quaker Meeting House. The sight of Mercer's men falling back in disorder threatened to unravel Washington's entire plan. Raw militia units, seeing Continental regulars retreating under British pressure, began to waver and break ranks. The psychological advantage gained at Trenton seemed about to evaporate in the face of British professionalism, and superior firepower. At this critical moment, the entire character of the battle and potentially the revolution itself hung in the balance. It was then that Washington himself appeared on the battlefield, riding directly into the zone of British musket fire with a disregard for personal safety that inspired every American soldier who witnessed it. The commanding general positioned himself between the retreating Americans and advancing British, his presence alone serving to steady the wavering Continental lines. His aide-de-camp, Captain Fitzgerald, later recalled closing his eyes rather than watch his commander ride into what seemed certain death. Captain Hamilton's artillery section had meanwhile occupied a commanding position overlooking the Ma in British formation near Nassau Hall. The young officer directed his guns with precision that belied his years, sending round shot crashing into the British ranks with devastating effect. The psychological impact of effective artillery fire proved as important as its physical damage, as British infantry discovered that their opponents possessed professional quality support weapons capable of matching European standards. The tide of battle began to turn as additional Continental units arrived on the field in good order. Colonel John Cadwalader's Philadelphia militia, initially held in reserve, deployed on the American left flank and began enfilading the British position. With sustained musket fire, these citizen soldiers, many of them prosperous merchants and artisans, fought with the determination of men defending their homes and families against foreign occupation. British casualties told their own story of professional soldiers, fighting with characteristic determination even when surrounded and outnumbered. Captain Leslie, commanding a company of the 17th Foot, had died at his post defending Nassau Hall's main entrance, while Ensign Anthony Martis of the 55th Foot fell during the final British counterattack. Before the general retreat began, these men, fighting for king and empire thousands of miles from home, earned the respect of their American opponents through their courage under fire. The Continental Army's medical services, such as they were, faced overwhelming challenges in treating the wounded from both armies. Dr. Benjamin Rush, serving as Surgeon General, had established a field hospital in Princeton's Presbyterian Church, where British and American wounded received equal treatment despite the political passions that had brought them to battle. This attention to humanitarian principles, even in the midst of revolutionary warfare, reflected the Enlightenment values that many Americans believed their struggle represented. Among the American wounded was Captain William Washington, the general's cousin, whose cavalry charge had helped turn the tide near Nassau Hall, but who had suffered severe injuries. When his horse was shot from under him, the young officer's recovery would require months of convalescence, during which he would serve as a living reminder of the personal costs that the Washington family had paid for American independence. His wounds, like those of hundreds of other Continental soldiers, represented sacrifices that extended far beyond the immediate military context. The capture of British supply wagons provided the Continental Army with desperately needed provisions, ammunition, and winter clothing. Soldiers who had marched from Trenton in rags now equipped themselves with British uniforms, muskets, and equipment that represented months of accumulated wear and shortages. This material dimension of victory proved almost as important as the psychological impact, since it demonstrated that American forces could sustain themselves. Through successful offensive operations, Washington's inspection of Princeton's captured installations revealed the extent to which British forces had prepared for a permanent occupation of central New Jersey. Warehouses contained provisions intended to support operations through the spring campaign season, while armories held enough weapons and ammunition to equip several regiments. The intelligence value of captured documents would provide Continental commanders with insights into British strategic planning that would influence American operations for months to come. The aftermath of Princeton also highlighted the evolving character of 18th century warfare as it adapted to American conditions. European-style battles between formed units remained important, but the role of irregular forces, local intelligence networks, and civilian support had proven crucial to American success. The Continental Army was developing a distinctly American approach to military operations that combined European tactical methods with frontier adaptability. As afternoon shadows lengthened across Princeton's battlefields, Washington began planning his next moves with characteristic strategic vision. The double victory at Trenton and Princeton had achieved its immediate objective of reviving American morale and demonstrating Continental military capability. But the war's ultimate outcome remained far from certain. British forces under Cornwallis were still approaching, and the Continental Army's position remained precarious despite its recent successes. The withdrawal from Princeton began in the early afternoon hours of January 3, 1777, as Washington reluctantly acknowledged that his exhausted army could not sustain another major engagement against the British reinforcements approaching from the south. The general's decision to retreat to Morristown, rather than attempt to hold Princeton, demonstrated the strategic wisdom that had carried him through months of defeats and narrow escapes. This was not the retreat of a beaten army, but the calculated movement of forces that had accomplished their mission and lived to fight another day. The Continental Army's march to winter quarters at Morristown proceeded with a discipline that contrasted sharply with the chaotic retreats of the previous autumn. Soldiers who had crossed the Delaware as demoralized fugitives now carried themselves with the confidence of men who had proven their worth in battle against professional European troops. The psychological transformation was as significant as any tactical victory, restoring the self-respect that American forces had lost during the disasters around New York City. General Cornwallis arrived at Princeton barely 4 hours after the last Continental soldiers had disappeared into the Watching Mountains, his advance guard finding only empty streets and the debris of battle. The British commander's frustration was evident as he surveyed the abandoned British positions and received reports of his losses from the survivors of Mawhood's command. The twin defeats at Trenton and Princeton had unraveled months of careful British planning and forced a complete reconsideration of their strategy for suppressing the American rebellion. The impact of Princeton extended far beyond the immediate military consequences, as news of the victory spread throughout the 13 colonies with remarkable speed. Dispatches carried by Continental couriers reached Philadelphia within 24 hours, and from there the intelligence radiated outward through networks of correspondence that connected every significant community from Boston to Savannah. Americans who had begun to despair of their cause found new reason for hope in Washington's dramatic demonstration of Continental military capability. International observers took careful note of the American victories as well. French agents, who had been quietly monitoring the rebellion's progress, reported to Versailles that the Continental Army had demonstrated staying power that merited serious consideration. The professional competence displayed at Princeton suggested that American forces might prove worthy allies in a broader conflict against British power, an assessment that would ultimately lead to the French alliance that secured American independence. The British response to Princeton revealed the strategic confusion that increasingly characterized their approach to the American war. General Howe's decision to abandon most of New Jersey and concentrate his forces around New York and Philadelphia represented a fundamental shift from offensive operations to defensive consolidation. This retreat from territory that had been conquered at considerable cost demonstrated that British resources were insufficient to maintain control over large areas. In the face of determined American resistance, Captain Hamilton's role in the Princeton victory established his reputation as one of the Continental Army's most capable young officers, leading directly to his appointment as Washington's aide-de-camp and his subsequent influence on American political development. The intellectual foundations of the American Republic were being shaped by men whose characters had been tested in the crucible of revolutionary warfare, and Hamilton's performance under fire at Princeton demonstrated the qualities that would later make him indispensable to the nation's founding. The Battle of Princeton also marked a turning point in American military development, as Continental forces began to demonstrate the tactical flexibility that would eventually overcome British conventional superiority. The combination of European style, linear tactics with American adaptability and local knowledge created a military capability that British commanders found increasingly difficult to counter. This synthesis of Old World professionalism and New World innovation became a defining characteristic of American military culture. The forgotten battle had achieved its strategic objectives. Beyond Washington's most optimistic expectations, the Continental Army had survived its darkest hour. American morale had been restored, and the revolution had gained the international credibility necessary for eventual victory. Most importantly, the citizen soldiers who had endured the march through darkness and the charge at Nassau Hall had proven to themselves and the world that Americans possessed the courage and determination necessary to secure their independence. Years later, as Americans celebrated their successful revolution and established their new republic, the Battle of Princeton would be overshadowed by more famous engagements like Yorktown and Saratoga. Yet military historians would recognize that the tide of the American Revolution truly began to turn during those crucial hours when Washington's army emerged from the winter darkness to strike at the heart of British power in New Jersey. The forgotten battle had saved the American cause when defeat seemed inevitable, transforming a demoralized retreat into the beginning of ultimate victory.